Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of the Quarantine Series. I'm Cam Corder, and I'm joined today with great friend, people know in the Y circles, David Gray. And again, to refresh everybody, the point of the Quarantine Series is really to encourage and motivate and inspire you. And just what talks about leadership and mission and getting to know people, and just so we can all become better leaders and better focused toward what we're trying to do in our everyday world, be it inside the Y or outside the Y. But I'm excited to have David, who's been a longtime friend and a friend of the YMCA. So David, tell everybody what you're doing now.
Okay, thanks, Cam. It's great to see you again. Wish we were doing this in person, but it's good to at least see your face on video. I have launched a new initiative called the BISO Collective, which BISO is actually BISO, which stands for Birmingham Software. So that's kind of the hidden message behind that name. And the idea is to acquire B2B software as a service businesses utilizing a buy and hold strategy. So unlike what most investors will do, they'll buy something and then try to grow it and flip it 3 to 5 years later. Our idea is to buy it and hold it and grow a healthy business for the long term. So really building truly what we call enduring companies. And then kind of from an altruistic standpoint, you know, we're in Birmingham, and this is not the Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas. And so we're definitely a secondary or maybe kind of third level tech city. And so a big kind of driver behind what we're trying to do is to create high quality jobs in the city in which we live. So that was a big motivation behind what we were doing.
What's the best advice you got as you started a new venture?
The best advice, I guess, you know, partner with good people. So I've partnered with a great family business. It's been around for 76 years, and they're kind of acting as the financial backers behind the idea. Just, you know, high quality, high integrity people, great reputation, have done a lot of what I'm doing, but in different industries outside of software. And so there's a lot of expertise there too, just not necessarily in the software sector. And so it's just been it's been a great partnership. I think that's the main thing when starting this, was just trying to figure out who is it that I wanted to spend the next 20 years in business with. And which I say that, and I kind of hesitate because I sometimes think when I say that 20 years to somebody who's a lot younger than me, they're thinking, I'm not sure you've got 20 years. I think I have 20 years and I want to stay in the game at least. And so I'm viewing this opportunity as a 20-year time horizon. And that's kind of, as I entered it, I spent a lot of time actually thinking about that piece of it. It's like, what time horizon am I considering? And if it was a 5-year time horizon, I would have taken probably a different strategy, but I'm really trying to figure out what do we do that's much longer term and has a positive effect on the business, because we're capitalists, but like I mentioned before, we want it to have a high impact on the city we live in and the people that live here. Yeah,
but that's for everybody listening. Take out your pen, write this down. That's great advice for almost everything in life. Find a good partner. Somebody that you can spend a long time with. Yeah, that's great advice across a bunch of barriers and lines there. That is great advice. You're such a great thinker, and I call you, you're almost a serial entrepreneur, and you're an innovator and all that. And probably in our 20-year relationship and friendship, have you developed that, or is that part of your DNA? How do you feed that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I'm not sure I view myself that way. So I guess it was developed. I would say, and it's funny, I had a conversation years ago, this is probably 15, 18 years ago, with a group of guys who were and it happened to be all guys, they were in their like 60s and maybe early 70s, and were kind of reflecting back on their career. And somebody invited me to this it was like a half day, really just a discussion. It was really interesting. And I noticed as we were talking for that half day, they all kept going back to like 2 or 3 things that happened in their life. And I had those same kind of experiences. There were always these 2 or 3 big things that impacted kind of my trajectory. And I think most people are that way. There's just these big influential kind of inflection points. And so for me, one of those from an entrepreneur standpoint is I was working for when my wife and I were first married, I was working for a very established traditional business in Chicago. I was doing software development and project management for them, but it was a company that had been around for decades. And this was in the late 90s. And my wife and I decided we wanted to move back down south. So we were going to move to Atlanta. And I told her, I said, this was in the dot-com boom. And I said, well, I'm not going to work for a traditional business. I'm going to try to work for a Silicon Valley based company. They were all opening offices at the time, probably incorrectly, but they were opening offices in Atlanta to cover like the eastern half or the southeast. And so I said, I'm just going to apply only to Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas based companies. And I'm going to go work for a startup. Just kind of, we were young and didn't have kids yet. And I thought I'm just going to try this. And so that probably was the turning point, because we were a meteoric rise. We were the 6th best IPO, opening day IPO in the history of the NASDAQ at the time we went public. We opened at 14 and closed at 56, which is multiple times higher than what even Airbnb and DoorDash did last week. So it was this great outcome until we found out the harsh reality of the dot-com bubble bursting in the middle of that. And then the harsh reality also of kind of mid-level employees like us had a 6-month lockout. And in that 6-month lockout, we all watched the stock price climb and then go down the other side. So it was worth nothing by the time it was over. But it, even though that was kind of a negative financial outcome, like I guess around, the 2001 timeframe, it still was like, I can never go back and work at a traditional company again. The speed of change, the innovation, the quality of the people, the impact you feel like you could have in an earlier stage company. It was like, I'll just never go back to work at what I would consider kind of a traditional business again.
Your previous company, you had this great culture. In fact, 10 years ago, I took my team down and we spent the day with you and your leadership and just talked about, the culture of your company. How do you get culture in an organization from the CEO desk to, in a YMCA world, to the pool, to the gymnasium, out on the soccer fields? Top to bottom, how do you influence that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, YMCA's face some difficult challenges in that. And I've spoken, you were nice enough to invite me up to speak to your group. And you probably heard some of this before, but, with part-time people, it's a little bit tougher, particularly when people are out on soccer fields and at pools, because it's easier probably in the context I was working in, where I had 150 people in a single office. It even got more complex when I left my role as CEO at Daxco. We were about 350 people and had offices in 5 cities. It became a new challenge of how do you do that, some of the same things when don't have that same proximity. And now we're all faced with this, certainly during COVID. Some of this stuff I think is relatively simple, and I'm sure I used this analogy when I talked to your group several years ago, is that, if what we used to refer to as the mood of the company, if the mood of the company is in a bad spot and you're wondering who to blame, you should go look for a mirror if you're the CEO, because the culture, in my opinion, needs to be owned by whoever the head of that organization is, whether it's the founder, the CEO, the executive director. Because what I've seen happen in companies where that's not the case, where it's like delegated to a head of HR or a director of culture or whatever, when the rubber hits the road and tough decisions have to be made, oftentimes financial tough decisions, if the person at the very top of the organization doesn't truly have a genuine belief in that culture, they're going to make decisions that are contradictory to that culture. So I think it has to start with the top of the organization. And then I think a lot of it's just simple blocking and tackling, which is simple in principle, but difficult in practice because it requires ongoing focus and attention forever. It's not an initiative you put a good culture in place, you work on it, you focus on it for 6 months, and then it just is on autopilot. For the 15 and a half years I had the privilege of leading Daxco, it's the one thing I tell people this all the time, it's the one topic I probably spent more of my brain power on and thought time, was how to keep the culture moving in a healthy direction. And so a lot of that is redundancy. Am I talking about the mission and values of the company? Am I reminding them why we do what we do? Am I reminding them the role we play in the lives of our customers? Are we talking about this over and over to the point where you almost think somebody's going to throw tomatoes at you because you've said it so many times? But it just requires you to continue to talk it, to show examples, to tell stories, to reinforce it in how you do hiring and how you fire, how you reward. All those things, I think, it's a constant, and it can feel repetitive to people, and it can feel like it's a hindrance to doing other things that are business related. But I think if there's thousands of case studies on this, that the companies that pay a lot of attention to this outperform on all other metrics too, around customer retention and financial metrics and employee satisfaction. And so I think it's got real business applicability. It's not some soft, squishy thing,
Yeah,
but it actually has hard business
the Wall Street
benefit.
Journal yesterday had a whole section on the Wall Street 250 or something, that were just the top companies. And so, and I always look back like, how does Chick-fil-A do it? And why does the next company not just go, well, let's do what they do? I mean, but somehow they've got that good to great flywheel going.
Yeah. So can I tell a really quick story on Chick-fil-A? It's funny you mentioned that. So we had, and you may recall this, we had Chick-fil-A and Southwest Airlines and Whole Foods and companies like that come and speak at our user conference. Had nothing to do with software. We just felt like they were best in class. And like Chick-fil-A has part-time people, they're geographically distributed. And how do you keep a culture like that? And I remember the guy who spoke at our conference had responsibility. He was like a district manager, had responsibility for 6 stores, one of which was in a mall. And I told him this story. At the time, there was a mall next to Daxco's headquarters where we used to be headquartered. And I said, I can go to that food court and you guys will have 3 lines, 20 people deep, and every other restaurant in the food court is empty. I was like, that must be so frustrating. And he said, well, I used to have a store very similar. And he goes, you know what's remarkable about that is there's nothing we do that's magic. It's just focus and attention. And we do it over and over. And we have the discipline not to stop. And he said, any one of those other operators could have walked to the end of my counter and watched me all day on how I managed that store. And they could have asked me questions and I would have openly shared with them how I was doing it. But the reality is most people don't have the discipline and willing to put the effort to actually do that. So they'll stay behind their counter and complain that they don't get any customers. And 6 months later, they'll go out of business. And so some of it's just plain discipline and the want to. Like, Chick-fil-A wants to do that repetitively over and over every day in every store. And you can tell a huge difference.
That's such a great point. That is such a great point, because it is about Chick-fil-A, just those companies that you mentioned too. So hopefully part of the people listening today, David, are young leaders, maybe an associate exec or a branch exec that aspires to notch up. What advice would you give the young leader that wants to grow and develop and just be better?
Yeah, one thing is, like, I grew up with blue collar parents that didn't go to college. We had, ingrained in us work ethic. And so I think my approach early in my career when I first got out of college was do what your boss says and do it well, and you'll be taken care of. It was kind of, I think, what had subconsciously been hammered in my head by my parents. And so that's kind of what I did. I probably wasn't the best at what I was doing, but I tried really hard and put forth effort and felt like it was my responsibility to collect that paycheck, to put forth a lot of effort. So I think that's number one. And if you're in the right organization, people will recognize that and they'll reward it and they'll give you opportunity. That's be the first thing. And then secondly, like, what are the things you want to be good at? And you should study it, and you should surround yourself by people who are good at that, and you should learn from them. And so, I think reading a lot is a good thing because it's inexpensive and you can, understand other people's approaches to leadership and careers. I think that's one way. Finding mentors is important. But I think it comes down a lot to just doing it, is getting out there and doing it and taking some risk. And particularly when you're young, if you have aspirations to be a CEO, whether it's of a YMCA or some other type of organization, what are the skill sets you're going to need in order to do that, and take some risks, take on projects that are maybe uncomfortable or jobs that are uncomfortable, and put yourself in a position to become more well-rounded. But I don't think there's necessarily any magic, and there's no games to be played. It's like if you put in the work, most of the time it's going to pay off. Not all the time, but most of the time it's going to pay off.
One of your past employees who is a professional blogger who is on the hit list to do a quarantine series, Chris Dunn, he blogged about that about last month, and I actually shared it with a friend yesterday about when the boss asks you to do something, take on the project, because that means they trust you or they're testing you and you want to come through. So that's great advice, I think. And I come from that too, and when the boss asks you to do something, do it to the best of your abilities. And if you work hard, people will notice in that. Who were your mentors in your career?
Yeah, it's funny. this is a weird thing. And as I looked back at my career at Daxco, I literally have started to kind of keep a list of things, lessons learned. One of them is I really wish I had spent more time proactively seeking out a coach, somebody who is more directly a coach. I mean, I had people who provided mentorship in spots. There was a guy named Tim Lamb who used to be president of ADP, the big payroll processing company, and he was a family friend, grew up with my mother in Cleveland, and we kind of stayed connected as a family. He ended up coming on our board, and so he had run a really large company, and he came on the board when Daxco was pretty small, and so he certainly, from a business perspective, gave a lot of helpful advice that I still replay in my mind. I've had great bosses earlier in my life who showed me what candor and transparency and accountability look like. So I think those are great. So it's been a series of people. It's not like one individual who mentored me throughout my career, but I do, looking back, in a more formal sense, I think I would have benefited from a coach. It's something that I probably recognize now, maybe with a little bit of wisdom and older age, that it's something I probably would have benefited from had I sought that out. So I recommend that to entrepreneurs all the time. Find a coach, find mentors. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I just read a book called The $1 Trillion Coach about Bill Campbell. And I just read it with a reading group that I lead. And, he's coaching Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt and Sheryl Sandberg and all these great leaders. I'm thinking, if those people needed coaches, what the heck am I doing without a coach? So it was pretty convicting to even hear those stories.
I think it goes both ways for people listening. I hope that you ought to seek out, like you said, the people who are good and pick their brains and talk to them and ask them to be the mentor. But I also think as leaders, we're obligated to mentor down to, to find people that, especially those that have a lot of promise and talent, and say, hey, I see this in you. Let me help you. Let me share my mistakes or what I've learned.
And it's interesting too, because and I waited too long, I procrastinated, but right before I left Daxco, this was like in probably 2 or 3 months before I left, I decided I'm going to start doing this with kind of mid-level managers that I didn't have direct access to on a day-to-day basis, because it felt like everything was getting filtered. And I'm like, well, I really want to kind of give back. And I don't necessarily have advice. I have opinions and I have experiences and I have scar tissue. And so I want to share that with people to help them in their career. And so I picked 4 kind of high potential leaders in our organization, sent them an email and said, hey, we're going to go to dinner, the 5 of us. And there was 4 of us. There was 3 of them and me. The 4 of us are going to go to dinner. We can sit at a 4-top table. Send me topics you're struggling with from a leadership perspective. We're just going to and they were kind of like, why are you doing this? So we went to dinner and it was great. And then I ended up leaving Daxco a couple months later, and we decided, we were chatting later and said, hey, why don't we keep doing this? So we started a kind of a coffee book club that we've now been doing almost for 2 years. And as a result of that, I was like, well, I need to do this with more. So I now have 16 people that are in reading groups. I do 4 different reading groups with 4 people each, plus me. So there's 17 of us all together. So every Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. till 8:30, I meet with a different group of 4 people that are all kind of high potential leaders and entrepreneurs, and just to talk about topics that are of interest to us. And so $1 Trillion Coach was one we did recently. And yeah, I think it is our responsibility as we progress in our career to make sure we're giving that back to people who would benefit from it. And so it's been a great experience for me to share ideas with them and to hear what their perspective is, because I'm still still learning.
Give us 2 or 3 books that you've read during the pandemic that should be on our read list, our Christmas list.
Yeah, I really liked The $1 Trillion Coach. I thought was really good. So I've got a lot of books, but Who, which is an interesting approach to hiring. It's about top grading. We read a couple framework books because I think this is something people aren't really all that good at typically, myself included. I could get better at it. We read Measure What Matters, which is a concept called OKRs. It was written by John Doerr, who was one of the early investors and mentors at Google. And then similarly, a book called Traction, which is the EOS framework, which is the Entrepreneurial Operating System framework. And both of those books are kind of setting up a simple framework for planning and measuring how your organization is doing. And then we read some other things that were less kind of framework style books. We read Becoming, Michelle Obama's book, which was really interesting. We read The Ride of a Lifetime, which is the former Disney CEO's book, which was really good. So we try to do a mix of books that are kind of more academic in nature, like Attraction or Measure What Matters, and then also some stories like Michelle Obama or Disney. We read Mark Benioff from Salesforce, his latest book. And so we like to kind of mix it up a bit.
Yeah, you gave me a habit because you used to give books. You gave me a book, and when you spoke to our group, you gave us all books. I like to do that. I like to give books, but I've had some feedback of, and I have a young group of 6 that we meet about 8 times a year. And we just do different topics. We visit ChickfilA, and we've spent a lot of time at ChickfilA's going, tell us how you do it, why you do it. And our question that like last week, we were dealing with a personnel issue. And my question to the leader was, how would ChickfilA handle this? And we processed it that way a little bit. But one of my staff told me, said, it's like you're giving me homework when you give me a book. You're giving me more work to do. But it's so funny. I temper sometimes the book that I give and what we try to read together.
Yeah, I did that. I had a new habit I started last year where if I read a really good book, I was going to try to create a 1-page summary for myself that I could sit on my desk just to remind me. My 1-page summary turned into like 5 or 6 pages on this book. It's actually called The One Thing, which is really good about focus. And I shared it with a bunch of people. And one of my friends emailed me back and said, I know at the top of this, you said this is just a teaser. You should read the whole book. But these notes are pretty exhaustive. So I don't think I'm going to read the book. I'm just going to read your notes. So I feel like I was helping them cheat. It was Cliff Notes by Dave.
Well, you're a great leader, and I appreciate the role you've had in developing my leadership, and then so many other Y leaders across the country. And enjoy connecting. I hope people connect, get a chance to watch this and reconnect. If you're watching this, instead of giving you a book, I want you to watch Ted Lasso. It's a new show that's out, and we should all lead like Ted Lasso. It's on Apple TV right now, just 1 season. If you watch Ted Lasso, which means you've watched this interview to the end, and you email me your favorite things about Ted Lasso, we're going to send you a gift. We're going to send you a gift from the Quarantine series. But David, thanks so much for all that you've done and your leadership. And everybody, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and just be the best leader that you can be. Thanks for watching. Thanks, David.
Yeah, Cam, I appreciate it. I love the YMCA, and I'm wishing you guys all the best when we get through this pandemic and get back to normal. So Merry Christmas to everybody, and good talking to you.
Likewise. Take care.
Okay.